Hello and welcome to the Secular Nation Podcast, brought to you by the Atheist Alliance of America. I am your host, Tim Brannon. With me, Michael X.
Hello.
Well, Mike, it's been quite a while. I think we've kind of, let's just say we didn't take a hiatus. We just took a long period in which we didn't get around to doing the show.
Yes, no excuses really, but we are going to be focusing on doing this every other month.
Hopefully. We got another one lined up for the next show.
It's a super top secret, but we will let you know as soon as possible. And you can also go to our Facebook page, and if you're somebody you'd like to hear from, or let us know. Contact us by Facebook and tell us who you'd like to hear from and what you'd like to hear on
Seriously,
this podcast.
We would really like to have some sort of...
It's not fun being in a vacuum. Please contact us. Let us know. What are we doing well? What are we doing not so well? But especially, what are we doing well?
All right. Well, right now, the Atheist Alliance of America, we are currently planning our conference for October 15th in Atlanta, Georgia. Right now, the Richard Dawkins Award will be awarded to Jerry Coyne,
who has a new book out.
Mm-hmm. We will be there as well.
Hopefully doing a live podcast. With,
yes.
I think the one we did last year was a lot of fun. So.
Oh, yeah, great. With RichardCarrier, who is our guest this episode, our first returning guest.
Indeed. I do have some business to bring up. The Atheist Alliance of America has recently announced the ACE Award, which is the Atheist Alliance of America Champions Education Award, which is a scholarship. So if you are an atheist college student, or if you know one, they have a shot at getting a $500 check from Atheist Alliance of America, and all they have to do is write an essay talking about the importance of secularism, and you can get that $500, and we will publish you in our magazine, Secular Nation, and you'll get a free print subscription to the magazine. To get details, go to atheistallianceamerica.org/scholarship.
Well, as I said, earlier this week, we sat down and talked to RichardCarrier, again, our first returning guest, about his new book on the historicity of Jesus, why we might have reason to doubt, or why we have reason to doubt. It's something like that. I am terrible with all these books and their subtitles. All right, and let's go to the interview. Hello, and we're now with our first returning guest on the podcast, Dr. RichardCarrier, author of On the Historicity of Jesus, Why We Might Have Reason to Doubt. Richard, great to have you back.
Yeah, nice to be here.
So you are a historian, scholar of sorts, correct?
That would be accurate.
Okay.
Yes, PhD from Columbia University, and I write on history and philosophy.
Before we get into your book, I thought maybe just give our audience just some basic idea of, like, what exactly do we know about history and how do we know it?
Oh, you mean like history altogether?
Yeah.
That's a big topic.
That'll be the first hour.
Yeah, just give us like a 30-second rundown on that.
Well, yeah. Well, quite frankly, I mean, just from the philosophy of history perspective, I mean, most people, especially in atheism and secularism, are very focused on science, and they don't think about, well, what is the epistemology of history? And, I mean, quite frankly, it's very similar. It's just the data is messier, or there's a lot less of it. So you have to, be a little more tentative in a lot of your conclusions a lot of the time. But basically, things that happened in the past leave evidence, right? They've caused the world to change. And so what you're doing is you're looking at how the world is now, and you're coming up with hypotheses for how it came to be that way. And some hypotheses do a really good job of explaining that, and others do a really poor job of explaining that. And generally, that gets you to the conclusion of which explanation is more likely, and that's what happened in the past, or what you would say most likely happened in the past. So that's the basic idea of it, is you're looking at trying to explain the evidence today with hypotheses about what happened in the past. And that's really all history is about, doing that. Now, that does mean that there are a lot of explanations that are equally compatible with the evidence, which just means you can't choose among those hypotheses. You can just say it's one of those things. That's frustrating for scientists, but it's normal for historians. We're used to that. And then there are things that you just don't know at all. But also, just like in science, you do have prior probabilities factor in. So you know from the body of what other people have said, all the evidence that you can read now, go in history books and read now what's been discovered, what's been figured out before, as it's recorded in the present, and you can get an idea for what typically happens in certain circumstances and what really, really rarely ever happens. Like, sorcery is pretty much not a historical causal factor, for example. And so whereas certain things about social dynamics, certain things about physics, certain things about how economies work, these are kind of universal, and so those oftentimes have a higher prior probability right out of the gate of explaining certain courses of events in history. You still have to test it against the evidence, but you're still thinking in these terms of weighing what typically has happened against alternatives, and then weighing the evidence in terms of which hypothesis makes that evidence most likely.
Does researching cognitive psychology, the faultiness of human memory and cognitive biases and things like that, I imagine that's had a big effect on history research lately.
Only a little bit. In terms of understanding how this affects how we interpret what witnesses write down, and especially like oral histories or people recording history that occurred decades before. Like someone's reminiscing or writing their autobiography at the end of their life. We know if they're writing about things 40, 50, 60 years earlier, that we do have to take into account cognitive biases and issues with how human memory versus how people think it works. And yeah, that is actually starting to creep in and affect how historians reason, which is a good thing. It just makes history better.
All right, so now getting on to your book on the historicity of Jesus, maybe to start out, what are the base evidences of Jesus?
Well, it's murky because it's complicated. And to start from the latest evidence, we have tons of like second century references to what's in the Gospels, for example, but or what Christians were claiming, which they were getting from the Gospels. But that doesn't really count. And a lot of people cite that evidence, but you have to point out that doesn't really count as independent evidence. It's just repeating other evidence that we have, and that has zero value. So you roll back and you go, well, what do we have that isn't that? And really all we have is what's in the New Testament. We have very little that counts outside that. And even what we do have outside that is very murky about whether Jesus actually existed. We have the letters of 1 Clement, for example, or the letter of 1 Clement, which when you actually read it objectively, it never actually seems to understand Jesus as a historical person who walked around Galilee and preached to the Jews. It seems to only understand Jesus as a revelatory being whom the apostles saw in visions, and that most of the things you learn from him, you learn by reading Scripture. Because oftentimes they'll say, as Jesus said, and then it will just quote Scripture, the Old Testament. And you're like, well, hold on. That's where you're getting Jesus' teachings? So you run into weird things like that. But if you want to look at stuff that actually sort of concretely puts Jesus on Earth history, the earliest and really the only independent evidence we have is in the New Testament. And then really it's just the Gospel of Mark, because you have the book of Acts and then you have the other Gospels. But those are all just based on or redactions of Mark. They're just different versions of it where they just rewrote it, right? They didn't like it, so they rewrote it. They wrote a new version of it. And so you really only have one gospel that portrays Jesus as a Galilean preacher. And there's no other independent corroboration of that fact at all. Not even in the letters of Paul. Paul has no references to Jesus even being a preacher or having a ministry, much less it being in Galilee. So that's problematic. And so when you actually look at the evidence like this, there's a lot of issues with it, where people have been taking for granted that everything corroborates everything else, but really it doesn't. Now, having said that, I'll bring up what is the best evidence that historicists can come up with to try and defend the historicity of Jesus, even after they acknowledge that as the problem. And really the only evidence there is, and there's some argument over whether you can extract anything from Mark, but that's a whole other debate as to whether there's any tool or methodology that you can use to prove that something in Mark actually comes from a historical fact rather than something he just made up or someone before him made up. So that's a whole separate debate. But and I think that debate loses on the historicity side, at least in the agnostic sense, that there's nothing that you can prove. So that leaves the epistles of Paul, and there's basically a few scattered sentences in Paul where he appears to refer to Jesus having a family. And if that were the case, if he was actually saying Jesus had a family that he knew, then that would establish historicity. So that's where the debate in the letters focuses on is what do those sentences actually mean? And I have a whole chapter on that in the book. And when you actually look at them, they're really weird, especially if you look at them in the original language, in the Greek that they're written in. They're really weird and obscure and unclear as to whether they're referring to an actual family or a metaphorical family or other metaphysical things that don't really connect to history. And so that's the actual, I think, where the debate ultimately is going to go is how do we interpret those sentences in Paul?
That's, I mean, one of the things for me is, in my debates about Christianity, is always we generally have to sort of say maybe he was or probably he was a historical figure of some kind, but not the actual Son of God. So it's kind of,
right.
For a long time, the idea of Jesus not actually existing has been sort of an icing on the cake issue.
Yeah, and certainly that's the next most likely hypothesis, right? Like even, I mean, worst case scenario for I don't know, worst case is probably the wrong word. But, I mean, at the very least, certainly if Jesus existed, he was just an ordinary religious leader who had some ideas and got people inspired, and then they wrote stories later that exaggerated and embellished and legendized and mythologized his story. And that's entirely compatible with secular worldview and entirely is literally the next most likely hypothesis. I just find that the what I call the Doherty thesis, the view that Jesus began as a revelatory being and was only transported into history in later literature, as happened to many other gods of the time, I think that theory actually makes better sense of the weird evidence that we have that survives from the ancient world. So I think it's more likely. But that's where the debate on that goes. But even if I were wrong about that, I would then agree that the mundane, secular history Jesus is the true one. And then there's a different varieties of different versions of that Jesus, that different theories about who he was and what he was trying to do that have been circulating in the scholarly community for decades. And it could be any of them that could be true. We just don't have enough data.
So would you actually recommend the book to, lay people like myself? I did find there was a lot of back-referencing to previous books and previous chapters.
Yeah, I mean, it's written for all audiences. And so, like, for example, if you're just a lay reader, you can just ignore all the footnotes, right? Yeah. The footnotes are there for scholars. Everything else is pretty approachable. The only thing that scares people off a bit is that it is long. But you have to look at it from the perspective that I'm setting you up into understanding the historical context and the origins of Christianity in general. And there's a lot of evidence to look at and go over. So it's more like a collection of books that have been bound together in a sense in that way. So yeah, it's definitely readable. Someday I would like to produce like a mass market, summary book or something. But I would need to find a publisher who would want to do that, because it wouldn't be worth doing it unless I had someone who was willing to market it, and get a wider attention. But that doesn't exist yet. So really all you have is that. And if you want sort of quick introductions, you can just Google around. I've done many talks, and those talks have been put online. You can watch the videos of them, or you can just peruse my blog under the Jesus tag and see what sorts of things I've written about it.
Now, again, I mentioned this when you were on the show last year, that there is a tendency for apologists to argue that there are no historians who claim that Jesus didn't exist. I was wondering, how controversial has your work been within your field?
Well, it varies. Of course, it's more controversial with Christian fundamentalists because they can't have this. And really, I think their opinion is kind of irrelevant, precisely for that reason, is that there is no way they can honestly evaluate this evidence. I mean, it's just they're so biased that that their opinions on it don't count, really. What you want to look at is what are the non-Christian scholars saying, the experts saying, and there you have a variety of camps. I mean, you have a lot of them are not even aware of my book, first of all. So obviously you can't really cite them as an opinion on it, because if they haven't even read it, they can't really say whether it's good or bad or not. You have several scholars who agree that this is a debate worth having, even if they side on historicity. Philip Davies is an example, and he wrote an article for Bible and Interpretation, which is a trade magazine within the field, kind of chastising Bart Ehrman for basically being too rhetorical and polemical against historicity challengers. And Philip Davies said, I'm pretty convinced that Jesus existed as a historical person, but I think the idea that he didn't is a respectable hypothesis that deserves attention in the field. And in fact, our field can only be regarded as respectable if we actually allow this to be a thing to debate within the field. So you have people like that who are sympathetic to allowing it into the galaxy. And I say galaxy of competing hypotheses of Jesus because there's a zillion of them. I mean, the number of contradictory theories of the origins of Christianity that are allowed to be respected within the field is enormous, even though that should be a scandal because, if you're looking at the same evidence and you're all getting different results, that's normally a problem for any kind of field. But so if they're willing to do that, they should allow this as to be one of the many that get discussed and talked about and included even in, like, for example, introductions to the history of Christianity. This should be included as just as viable as the zealot hypothesis or just as viable as the apocalyptic prophet hypothesis and so on. So that you have that camp. And then you have some that are even more sympathetic and actually agree at least that it's 50-50. So we have a number of historicity agnostics. Hector Avalos just recently came out saying, I think it's 50-50 whether Jesus existed or not. I think there's good arguments on both sides, and so he's a historicity agnostic. We have many others who go even a little bit further than that, are fairly convinced Jesus didn't exist. We have Thomas Brodie, Thomas Thompson, Robert Price famously. But also you have like some sitting professors in the field like Kurt Knoll and Art Droge, who are also at least historicity agnostics and publicly out as such. So the idea that there are no historians in the field who agree with this thesis is simply not true. But then you have some who are just really angry and annoyed by the hypothesis and really just can't abide it. And that's like Bart Ehrman is one of those.
Yeah.
So you have the whole gamut really.
Well, if they're Christian historians, well, obviously they're biased, so their opinions should be discounted. And if they're non-Christian historians, well, obviously the historical evidence wasn't enough to convert them to Christianity, so they can be disregarded.
Well, I wouldn't agree with that second lemma because the question of whether there was a mundane, ordinary historical guy is entirely compatible with not being convinced of Christianity.
Absolutely.
Right? So I think that would at least be an understandable position to say, you know what? I'm not convinced that Jesus was the Son of God for sure, but surely there was at least a dude, and then they'll adduce some reasons for that. And on my blog, I've written many blogs addressing this. I have one on a list of responses to, I think it's called List of Responses to Historicity Defenders or something like that, where I collect and update the blogs that I've written. It's basically an index, links to all of these blogs, and alphabetized by scholar, where they've written something like, this is why I think Jesus existed. Some of them are ridiculous. Some of them are actually pretty good. And so I've written responses to all of them, like why that evidence doesn't logically lead to your conclusion. So people who are interested in that can go find that one blog, that index blog, and go hunting through it and see the kinds of reasons the historians have given for saying, well, at least there was a mundane Jesus. Of course, on that index, I have both Christians who are convinced Jesus is the Son of God, and then also some secular scholars who are not convinced of that, but are still convinced that there was some sort of historical Jesus. So you get the whole gamut of from the ridiculous to the plausible.
I remember being very annoyed by even the idea of Jesus not existing, even after I lost my Christianity. So it sounds like, some of the more unbiased scholars also have that reaction, and it almost seems shocking. And I guess there's some reason for that, because there are certainly some atheists out there who seem to, they're on team atheism, and so anything that gives them winning points, that seems like a lot of fun to make that argument.
Yeah, and I've even written a blog about that, like how that's actually a bad argument. If your goal is to convince people Christianity is not true, the Jesus didn't exist argument is the worst argument to be using for that, because it's so much easier to show them that the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, for example, even if you just say, we'll just grant the historicity of Jesus, the evidence still way sucks if you're going to try and be convinced that this is the Son of God and so on. That's a much easier argument to make, and it's a much more persuasive argument to make. So you can concede the historicity of Jesus for evangelical purposes, the missionary purposes of getting people to realize that their religion doesn't hold up. If you try to argue for the non-existence of Jesus, you're using a weaker hypothesis than that, and you're using one that they're more emotionally hostile to. So right. It's not effective. So I just get annoyed by atheists who try to use that as a club, like your religion is stupid because Jesus didn't even exist.
Right. Well, and that won't even work against people like Shelby Spong or the more postmodern forms of Christianity, where, like with Buddhism, does it matter if the Buddha existed, since the concept of Buddhism is what a lot of practitioners follow. And so now Christianity is merging into something like that.
Yeah. Oh, well, I mean, that's a really fringe movement in Christianity, but it could become bigger. You're right. But you're right. In Buddhism, like, they don't care. Like, if it would be revealed that Buddha didn't exist, they go, oh yeah, but Buddha's just a character representing the cosmic truths, right? So that would be entirely compatible with Buddhism, and it's not even a threat to them at all. And I've had this conversation with a variety of Buddhists, so yeah, it's not an issue for them. But yeah, historicity of Jesus is a big issue for Christians who need their religion to be in a certain way. And that's mostly the conservative evangelical branches, the Catholics primarily, although not exclusively, because Thomas Brodie, who is one of the deniers of historicity, is a Catholic priest, and even in his book has a whole chapter at the end trying to explain why Catholicism is still true, even if there wasn't a historical Jesus. Now, that's a really radical reinterpretation of Catholicism, which I'm sure the Vatican is 200 years away from ever adopting. But so it's even, sort of, you can wedge it into Catholicism somehow. But certainly if you're looking at like the Shelby Spong's type liberal Christianity, there is certainly a good window there where you can introduce Jesus as a character representing divine truths, and that this is just communicated by God in some way through inspiring people to write these stories. And so you could rescue Christianity on that model. It's just that's not going to be evangelical conservative Christianity.
Right. Not that I'm trying to help or anything, but
yeah.
Another common apologetic argument, I'm sure you've heard it, is the die for a lie argument.
Yeah.
I was wondering, is there any historical basis for that at all?
No.
Yeah.
I mean, even from a sociological model, it doesn't hold up because tons of people die for a lie. Like throughout history, that happens a lot. It's like if you think there is a greater good you're dying for, and it's necessary to maintain a lie for that greater good to be achieved, you will die for it. And so that's a reality. But you don't even need to point that out. I mean, the reality is that we have no historical evidence of anyone, and I mean anyone, not a single person, who would have been a witness to Jesus, having someone come up to them and saying, deny what you saw Jesus do or we'll kill you. And then they're going, no, I will not. They kill them. No, it doesn't happen. We actually have no record of why anyone died who would have been in a position to know. Like even Paul, we have no record of why or how he died or who killed him or what the context of it was. Even when we have the Book of Acts, which is a hugely unreliable, it's basically historical fiction. But even if you were to treat it like history, it mentions one of the Jameses, one of the original disciples, supposedly, according to the Gospels, being executed, but it just says, oh, he was executed. It doesn't explain why he was executed. It doesn't explain if he could have gotten out if he denied what he saw. I mean, it doesn't give you any context that establishes that he died for a lie. And it's problematic because what Christians would have been dying for is their belief that if they follow Christ, that they will have eternal life. They can have that belief based on all kinds of weird things that people today would agree are bogus, but they would still have that sincere belief, and they're dying for that belief. They're not dying for being an eyewitness to a guy walking around Galilee. That isn't something anyone would kill them for. It was so that the whole they wouldn't die for a lie thing just does not hold up anywhere in terms of the logic of trying to support Christianity or historicity.
If they wanted to be consistent, then they would become Falun Gong.
Right.
But another thing I was wondering if that whole sort of scenario is at all consistent with Roman practice? Because I always hear that seems more like something you hear from the Spanish Inquisition than from ancient Rome. In the same story, we have, Pontius Pilate just, trying to, begging to release Jesus.
Oh, yeah. Well, of course, that depiction in the Gospels is designed to not make the Romans look so bad. And Pontius Pilate was a ruthless fuck, if I can use the word.
Go right ahead.
that he had no trouble just killing fucking whoever, right? So that depiction of Pontius Pilate is massively ahistorical, and so that's not plausible. But your question is actually more important if we're looking at the whole "die for a lie" thesis, because we do have the earliest example we have of Romans executing Christians is in the letters of Pliny the Younger. And in about 110 AD, people were accusing other people of being Christians, and so he was hauling them in, and he didn't know what to do with these people because he didn't know, Christians was, even by 110 AD, Christianity was so unknown that even this guy, who was one of the most educated legal scholars and government experts in the whole Roman Empire, had never heard of them. He had no idea what crimes they were guilty of. He didn't even know what penalties to do. He was kind of at a loss. So he wrote a letter to Emperor Trajan asking him, people are accusing these Christians and I don't know what to do with them. What crimes are they guilty of? And he explains what he did do. And we know how he treated it is basically there was a law in ancient Rome against illegal assembly. Now we take for granted that we have in our Constitution, it says, the right of the people to peaceably assemble is in there, right? It's actually written in. And the reason that's written in there is that that's actually entirely new. That has never been the case where you grant the people the right to peaceably assemble. Throughout history, for thousands of years, governments always made that illegal because it was a threat to the public order to have people assembling. And that means clubs even, clubs, even religious orders, you're getting together, that's a political threat. And it's not because it's a religious threat, it's that this looks political to us. And so the Roman Empire set up a system where they had, basically you could get licensed by the government to assemble. So if you were, a watermill guild and you wanted to assemble to talk and chat about building watermills, you could get a license from the government that says, yeah, okay, we approve the watermill guild, that's okay, we're not scared of you. And all the religions would do that too. So different religious cults and sects, there are lots of them in the empire, would petition to get a license from the government. And the government would say, yes, okay, we approve of you assembling and doing these things. Now, in certain provinces, the government was more fearful about these things. So to give you an example of how this worked, in a different letter of Pliny, completely separate correspondence with Trajan, one of the guilds that was very commonly given licenses were the firefighters guilds. For obvious reasons, you want people to be able to assemble to fight fires when they break out in the city. And so, this is a public order matter. So the government certainly issued licenses for the firefighters. But in this one province in Asia Minor, which is modern-day Turkey, there was so much political unrest, and recently there had been basically a massive uprising where people just started murdering Romans everywhere. Not recently, but recently enough in memory that the Romans were worried about this, and so they were not issuing licenses even for firefighting clubs. So Pliny wrote to Trajan and said, "Look, our cities are frickin' burning down. Please, let's lift this stupid ban on giving licenses to the firefighting guilds so we can have firefighters." And Trajan actually wrote back and says, no, we're too worried about political unrest there. You cannot give licenses to the firefighters. You'll just have to spontaneously rile up the city to fight the fires. And this is the kind of thing. So the Christians basically sort of ran afoul of this law that they were essentially assembling. They did not petition the government to get a license to do what they were doing. And so this was basically a form of treason. And so when Pliny executes Christians, he's not executing them for being Christians. He's executing them for the crime of illegal assembly, which is a form of treason. This is a tyrannical government. So this is the kind of thing that they were doing. It was just the fear that they might be mobilizing politically to start a rebellion. It had nothing to do with what the Christians actually believed. And even because really religious freedom was a thing under the Roman Empire in a way that it was never under Christian rule. And so that's why Pliny was bothered by this. It was these guys just seem to have a harmless religious belief. It doesn't seem like there's anything wrong with that. But the illegal assembly aspect bothers me. And so that was really the issue for him. And so it wasn't like Pliny took these people in, and when he asked them to deny Christ and worship the emperor's guardian spirit, he wasn't doing that because he was offended by their religion. He was doing that because he wanted to prove that they were loyal to the empire and therefore were not a political threat. It was all just the politics of it that was concerning him. And so he didn't, it wasn't, and none of these people were eyewitnesses, so it wouldn't matter. And really the people that didn't acquiesce, and therefore he had them executed. And so he was so appalled that they would not just, what's the difficulty of saying just deny Christ and worship the statue? Like, what's the big deal? Anyone who would refuse to do that, he figured, wow, these people are fanatics, therefore they are a political threat. And so for him, it wasn't the question of making them deny that Jesus existed. It wasn't making them deny that he was resurrected. It was only like, just curse Christ and worship the statue so you can show that you're politically on board with the emperor and stuff. And that was it. So the whole, when you look, and that's what apart from actual mobs rising up and just randomly rioting and killing Christians, where recanting would not have saved them, those are the only ways that Romans were actually killing Christians. So there was never an occasion where it was like a sword put to their neck and say, deny Jesus rose from the dead or we'll kill you. No, that never happened. That wasn't a thing.
And that probably would have been after, like, anyone who would have actually been a witness to the resurrection probably wasn't around anymore.
Oh, for sure. You have like in the book of Acts, and even in the letters of Paul, there's references to certainly the arresting. We're not entirely sure what punishments were inflicted. The arresting of Christians who would have been in that period of possible witnesses. But it's not entirely clear what they were being arrested for, what they were being punished for, what would have gotten them off. We have no clear discussions of what the trials or legal issues were. And by the way, this was only the Jews doing this, not the Romans. When we have the letters of Paul, at this time when Paul was writing, this is before the Jewish War between 66 and 70 AD, by imperial decree from Julius Caesar himself, and it was reiterated by later emperors, the Jews were given, because they actually sided with Julius Caesar in the Civil War, Caesar granted them the power of their own laws. So the Jews were allowed to govern other Jews by their own laws, and the Romans were not to interfere with that. So when we see in Paul talking about persecution of Christians, he's only talking about Jews persecuting some sort of blasphemers within Judaism, completely independently of the Roman authorities. The Roman authorities couldn't care, but they had granted the Jews the right to do this. And so that's the thing that's going on. But we have no clear descriptions of what it was the Christians were accused of by the Jewish authorities, how the trials turned out, what the punishments were. We have no record of this. So we don't really know what was going on in that respect.
Mike, did you want to get back on that Rolling Stone story at all, or is that like, is the off point kind of gone for that?
The off point, well, it was mostly about motivated reasoning. That like I said, even when I was a Christian, was a newly formed atheist, I found the argument that Jesus didn't exist as kind of an oh come on. So we got there.
Yeah, okay, but no, it doesn't connect to Rolling Stone though.
Yeah, well, there were these ads where every issue there was Jesus proof fictional. I think it had even a picture of Josephus, but my memory might be.
No way! Wait, when was this?
This was back in like the 70s and maybe mid 80s.
It must be mid 80s.
Yeah, you know what? That's right, because that's when I was in college. Was mid to late 80s, and
this
that's
is
what I remember.
interesting because that sounds like Joseph Will, and I didn't know that he was promoting his theory in magazines that early, because I think he came into his money in the 90s, and this Joseph Atwill is one of these. This is another problem that's worth pointing out, and it's a big issue, especially for trying to convince serious academics, because there are a lot of these tinfoil hat cranks who are promoting the non-existence of Jesus that have just the most ridiculous theories and are not experts in the field and don't even read Greek. And so they make awful arguments that are completely inaccurate. And so they make it look embarrassing and stupid. And Joseph Atwill is one of these guys. And he's got lots of money, so he really promotes this theory. His theory is that Christianity was completely fabricated by the Roman Emperor Titus in conjunction with Josephus, the historian. Josephus was hired by Titus to basically forge the entire New Testament and somehow use this to pacify the Jews. It doesn't make a lot of sense, but nonetheless, this is the theory. It's ridiculous top to bottom, and I have a blog on this for people who are interested. Atwill's Cranked Up Jesus is the title of the blog. You can Google that. And I explain in there why this just doesn't hold up. It's a ridiculous theory, but he has lots of money, so he's really good at promoting it. So he's funded a really high quality documentary. He's put ads out in major publications everywhere, and he issues press releases that get picked up. He even had Dawkins retweeted one. This is how much attention he gets. The press releases look impressive. Like he makes these amazing claims. You're like, wow, this is. Holy crap, really? But then when you go and look and listen to the lecture, you're like, okay, you just didn't prove a single thing you said in the press release.
So, in other words, I was right to think of him as a crank.
But
the
absolutely.
The good news is that's how I learned about who Josephus was. And then when I found out later that, monks had retranscribed Josephus, that it all made sense.
Yeah, where they fabricated that one paragraph about Jesus and Josephus, for sure. That's there are so many instances of that, by the way. There are two things that frustrate me and other historians, but it happens so often that they just sort of take it for granted and forget the implications of it. One is how many frickin' times you find a document in ancient Christianity that has either been forged or has been doctored. And so many times where we know for a fact that they fucked with it. And so like, well, we're not entirely sure which part of this document goes back to the original. And you're like, this happens again and again and again and again. And it just becomes like noise. But then if you step back and realize, holy crap, like forgery and doctoring of evidence was the normal mode of operation of ancient Christians.
And they didn't use track changes either. So
absolutely.
Bad joke, sorry.
No, but you're absolutely spot on. No, they would conceal that evidence if they could. That's one. And the other frustrating thing, which is somewhat unrelated to the present topic, though, but as a historian of ancient science in particular, it frustrates me, is how many times I'm reading where someone will describe this freaking awesome ancient science book that I totally want to read, but the Christians didn't preserve it. And it happens over and over and over and over again, which is really annoying. Like all of the treatises, the empirical, experimental treatises on gravity, and yes, there were some after Aristotle. So Aristotle gets ragged on for his stupid gravity theory. After Aristotle, Strato and Hipparchus both wrote extensive treatises on gravity in which they were performing experiments with falling objects. Both those treatises were not preserved, and we only have like the barest references to them, descriptions of them, and some minor quotes from them. And that's one of the most frustrating things ever. And I find this happens over and over and over again, like treatises on the study of magnetism, lost. It's like all of this stuff that we run into, like, oh, I want that book. Why don't I have that book?
Fucking magnets. How do they work?
Yeah. So, and we have some references to that. Like Galen talks about experiments on magnets. So we know people were writing about it, but we don't have that stuff. So that's the other thing that annoys me, is that the medieval Christians just threw away so much science that it's just really annoying.
I was actually thinking of getting into perhaps more recent history. Another common apologetic argument is talking about how atheists kill more people than religious people, like just in recent years with, whatever dictator they want to attribute atheism to and attribute atheism to their actions. Like, because I do think we kind of forget the fact that, like, the idea of genocide is kind of a recent thing.
Oh, yeah. The idea of it being bad is recent. Yeah. I mean, the idea of doing it is in the Old Testament, so it goes really old. But yeah. Well, I think one of the main things, though, is when you hear that argument, they're always putting Hitler in there because they think Hitler's an atheist. And this is something where I actually know a lot about, because I actually published an article on this issue. There were a bunch of quotes going around where Hitler seems to be anti-Christian and seems to be pro-atheist. And Dan Barker at Freedom from Religion Foundation, back when I was in grad school, knew I could read German. I could do German transcribing of articles. And so he asked me, like, could you hunt down the original German for these things and see if they're being translated correctly or what the context is? And I said, yeah, sure, that's easy. I'll do that for $50. And so Freedom from Religion Foundation sent me a grant of $50, research grant to do this. And that just dropped me down a rabbit hole because, first of all, I found out that the English does not agree with the German at all, or very little. So then now I have the problem of, okay, why? Like, that's weird. And there's two different German versions. It's like, that's weird. And then there's a French version, French translation that the English is an exact translation of. And I'm like, that's even weirder. And no one else in Hitler studies. I did the general research of looking at people. Lots of historians rely on this book. It's called The Hitler's Table Talk, and it's a huge book. It's when Hitler was in a bunker in Poland, he would just rant commonly over dinner or tea or whatever. And Martin Bormann, who was his secretary, had the stenographers in the bunker just record everything Hitler ranted. And he says, just whatever he says, just record it all and transcribe it all, and I'll edit it, and it'll be the new manifesto for the victorious Third Reich, because we're going to win, obviously. And so that's what happened. Now, I think it stops, 42. I can't remember if it was 42 or 44, but once they started realizing they were losing, then suddenly it stopped happening. But anyway, so there's this massive document of all this collection of rants, and they're all dated and timed with lists of who was present. And so there's two different versions, because one of the stenographers smuggled his notes out, and then Martin Bormann's semi-edited copy somehow, we think, got out. And there's different accounts as to how that occurred. And so we have two different German versions, but there's this one guy, Francois Genoud, who is this Swiss banker, unrepentant Nazi to his death in the 90s. He was a financer of terrorists. He financed, Carlos the terrorist, famously. Wow. He was one of the Swiss bankers who helped the Nazis launder all of their stolen Jewish money, right? Well, all the money they stole from the Jews they killed. But anyway, so a really shady guy. But this guy buys up a lot of Hitler memorabilia and tries to profit off of it. So he was the guy who tried pushing the Hitler diaries that I think turned out to be forgeries. Yeah. And so he's the guy who had Martin Bormann's copy of this Hitler's Table Talk. And he's the guy who produced the French translation that completely turns Hitler into an atheist and does not agree with the German. So there's a lot of unanswered questions here, but the biggest thing is that no one had noticed this in the field of Hitler studies. And so I was like, this is a scandal. And so I wrote up all my research. I was able to prove conclusively that the English came from the French, because the English translators made mistakes in translating the French based on idioms that only exist in French. So, and there are other aspects of things. So it was, I had them dead to rights that that's what happened. And so I published this in German Studies Review, and it's really transformed Hitler studies, because now all the historians of Hitler know they can't rely on the English. They now know the French is not reliable. They now know there's two German versions, so they got a problem there. And so now you'll find my article cited in new studies about Hitler's religious beliefs and stuff, and it's in footnotes and things. So that's just a weird thing I did, and it's not because I'm in Hitler studies. That's not my field, but I am a paleographer. So one of the things I do is textual criticism. That's one of my fields of expertise that I learned at Columbia, and all I was doing with this was basically doing that, except with modern languages. And so that has inspired a professor in Sweden by the name of Professor Nilsson, who's actually engaging now in a kind of Dan Brown investigation. Like, he's trying to find family members of people. He's hunting down, digging through archives. He's trying to figure out how all this happened. And he's already uncovered some weird stuff. And he's going to start publishing it too. And all inspired by that article.
The Hitler Code.
Yeah. Yes. But the end of all this is that when you look at the original German, especially the most reliable German edition of the Hitler's Table Talk, it's very clear that Hitler was a believer. He not only was a believer in God, he believed God had sent him and that he was doing God's will in eliminating the Jews. He believed that he was going to go to heaven and meet all these wonderful people. He was a creationist. In fact, he says, the one thing that separates man from the animals is that man can recognize that there is a creator. He's an old earth creationist, though, so at least that. But the point being is that he's very definite. And he also believed in Jesus, but he believed in the positive Christian Jesus. Positive Christianity was the Nazi form of Christianity, in which Jesus was an Aryan, and that he was, therefore, all of the Gospels are interpreted as Jesus ragging on the Jews and explaining how the Jews are awful. And so Jesus is actually like the ultimate proto-Nazi to them. So they love things like when he's complaining about the greed of the Jews, like the clearing of the temple and no mammon before God, all those kind of things, and the pay unto Caesar. Like, they love those passages. The Nazis love those. Ironically, so do modern Christian patriotic Americans. But so that's the views that he had. So he's clearly not an atheist. He's clearly a believer, and so you really can't include him in the statistics for atheist mass slaughters.
There's always usually like unequal criteria for what we call like atheist slaughters versus religious ones. Because for religious, it has to be, you know, like the Inquisition, or it has to be very specifically done in the name of a church or religion. Like atheist, just like an atheist did it.
Yeah. No, you're spot on. That's an absolutely correct observation. That is the disparity. They're dinking the numbers with that equivocation fallacy. That's what's going on there. And by the way, for anyone who's interested, my article on German Studies Review, including some new notes updating on the Professor Nielsen situation, that is reproduced in my book, Hitler, Homer, Bible, Christ, for people who want an easier access to it. In fact, all of my papers that I've published in history journals, academic peer-reviewed history journals, up to 2014, all of those are in Hitler, Homer, Bible, Christ. So for people who are interested in reading those kinds of things, but don't have access to a university library, that's the place to go for that.
Well, it's funny because to your point, Tim, let's say Hitler was an atheist. We still had Gott mit uns, and the culture was primarily Christian. I mean, I always thought that Hitler was kind of a quasi-pagan, or Nazism kind of had a quasi-pagan philosophy, and the Germans themselves, if Hitler was an atheist in Germany, wasn't.
Right, absolutely. The Gott mit uns thing, that means God is with us, for those who don't know. But that was actually stamped on the belt buckles of the standard line infantry of the German army in World War II. That's how godly they were. But also, yes, there were actually a variety of different Nazi camps of thinking. There were atheist Nazis, like Martin Bormann was a full-on naturalist. So he reinterpreted all religion in terms of atheism. So there were atheist Nazis. But there were also the neo-pagan Nazis, because they were very like, German Aryanism is so superior that even Christianity was a little too Jewish for them, right? Whereas like Woden and all of the true native German religion had to be truer to the Aryan cause. And so there were these weird Nazi neo-pagans as well. But the largest movement within Nazism was this positive Christianity movement, which was a kind of, I want to say, non-denominational revision of Lutheranism, because Lutheranism was their version of Christianity, right? Because Martin Luther, got things going in Germany, so they really followed the Lutheranism was more of the patriotic German thing to do, but it was still a little too sectarian for them. So positive Christianity sort of tweaked that, got rid of a lot of the sectarian dogmas, and created as more of a stripped down kind of Nazi-friendly version of Christianity, and it incorporated a lot of the anti-Jewish conspiracy theories as well. Which is interesting because Martin Luther's program against the Jews, and this is in Hector Avalos wrote a really excellent article about why the Holocaust was caused by Christianity, not atheism, or not Darwinism specifically, as the Christians will say, because he points out that Martin Luther's program, he wrote out a list of things to do to the Jews, and Hector Avalos shows this, and then he shows what the Nazi program against the Jews were, and it's item by item exactly the same. So that, in fact, the Nazi program against the Jews was just carrying out what Martin Luther, this founder of Protestantism, actually was trying to do with the Jews. And so it wasn't Darwinism that was leading it; it was Christianity, Christian anti-Semitism that was doing it. And that's in Hector Avalos' paper on that is in The Christian Delusion, I think, edited by John Loftus.
So Richard, I guess is it in June you're teaching a course on secularactivism.org?
Yes, literally this next month in June, June 2015, I am teaching. I do every year. I do this every year. I do each one of my courses that I teach online for Partners for Secular Activism. Every one of those courses, well, certain ones I teach every year, and this is one of them. And it's on the historicity of Jesus. Basically, historicity of Jesus, the best evidence for and the best evidence against. And so the main course text is on the historicity of Jesus, my book, but then I supply other readings and stuff, and we have discussions about the reading material in terms of looking at, well, what is the best case for historicity or against it? And so people can understand the evidence, and I really do a good effort at representing the other side. So you can see like the best opposition, because no one else has really written this. And so I do my best to try and present that so people can have a full look at the evidence. And one of the benefits of doing that is, when you pay the registration, and it's fairly cheap to do the 1 month course, you're essentially paying for a 1 month consult with an expert, right? Me, the PhD in ancient history, so that you can ask all the questions you want to ask and get my full attention and response and things like that. So that's another benefit of these courses. So for people who are interested in that, that starts this June, and you can register online. It's at Partners for Secular Activism.
Yes, and members of Atheist Alliance of America get a 10% discount for these courses. So all the more reason to both join AAA and to take part in this course.
Yeah, that's awesome.
All right, well, Richard, it was great having you back on the show. It's the book is on the historicity of Jesus, Why We Might Have Reason to Doubt, and we hope to have you back on sometime.
Yeah, absolutely. Would love to be back. For people who want to follow up on all things Richard Carrier, just go to richardcarrier.info.
Thank you very much.